Hello and welcome to the Growing Healthy Families podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Haggerty. On this show, I interview the world's top health experts so that you can know with certainty what it takes to give your family a life of epic health and wellness.
As parents, we don't want to see our kids struggle. I knew that he had the potential. I knew that something needed to be done.
It was hard. We would get frustrated. We didn't know how to deal with it. I was more emotional about it.
Sure that, we're here. Amen to that, brother. Amen to that. So these early life stressors, they're a massive impact to the development of a child's nervous system. I want you to see this. Hope you're ready. That's what I'm talking about right there. Okay? This is happening in the city of Cleveland 50% of the time, every day, every year, right now. Our city has one of the highest intervention rates in the entire country because we do have a lot of high-risk hospitals, right? Fairview is known for being high risk. But that is what happens to 50% of the babies every day. So can you imagine that there's a pretty good likelihood that there is going to be some significant stress put into that child's nervous system right from the very beginning? This is what we experienced with our daughter, right? She was a vaginal, but she was a vaginal delivery with an intervention, right? And it triggered significant stress responses with her that caused her to start going down that road. And so when we start talking about how this has an impact, it's important you have to understand some of the research that's been done. So there's a researcher named Dr. Sam Wang. Dr. Wang is a neuroscientist and he's a researcher out of Princeton. Dr. Wang has done some really amazing research, created this concept of what's called developmental dyaskesis. Has anyone ever heard this term before? So I want you to understand what this is, okay? So we're going to talk about these two doctors. So Dr. Robert Malolo, has anyone ever read any of his books, heard his name before? Okay, I'll show you his stuff. So he created this concept called functional disconnection syndrome, and we'll dig into these both quite a bit. So Dr. Wang's, his research study about developmental dyaskesis, what they showed is that the birth process, the birth trauma, the more significant the birth trauma, right? C-sections, vacuums, forceps, combos, the greater the likelihood that a child would have a spectrum diagnosis. In his research, his words, the correlation between birth trauma and a future diagnosis of ASD is greater than the correlation between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. Digest that for a second. It's amazing when you really realize that process triggers such a massive stress response. Because when you start talking about things like these high intervention deliveries, and that's what's the commonality amongst all these kids, is that the significant stressors they experience, they keep their brain at such a high level of stress that eventually they go not just through the process of being stressed out, it will disrupt development midstream and cause a brain disconnection, ASD, right? And so when you look at his work, and let's compare it to Dr. Malolo's. So Dr. Malolo created, what's that? So Dr. Malolo, he's the author of several key pieces of literature on this, and you may want to get these for your libraries. I think they're very helpful for teachers, for moms and dads, and for practitioners to have these in your library, because what they do is they give you some very important insights. So he authored Disconnected Kids, Reconnected Kids, and Autism. And he created this concept of the functional disconnection syndrome, which is the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain being out of sync. Let me skip ahead. I want to show you the books here, so in case you want to see those. If anyone's ever heard of the Brain Balance Achievement Centers, he's the person who founded those. So I did an interview with him on our podcast that aired probably about 2 months ago. So where he talks quite a bit about this concept. So if you want the full scope on it, he can explain it very well. Talked about some of the research that he's doing in conjunction with Harvard on brain function, brain reconnection, doing the types of exercises that he shows in his books. So he does work with some of the worst cases of autism. He's doing a lot of overseas research in the Czech Republic, and the work that he's doing with brain balancing, they're actually getting kids that are nonverbal autistic children to speak. Pretty cool, huh? So here's the gist. When we talk about brain imbalances, okay, so we know the way that the right brain and the left brain are built to work, and this is a summary, But when you talk about having a right brain imbalance, right? So we know that the right brain has very specific jobs and duties, okay? When we start looking at it, when we start seeing deficits, we start seeing then these challenges, right? Things like poor comprehension, behavioral issues like oppositional defiance, impulsiveness, disruptive, sensory challenges. So sometimes not very emotive. They tend to struggle with making friends, a lot of issues with social norms. And common diagnoses that are associated would be things like your ADHDs and ADDs, oppositional defiance, so a lot of issues with pervasive development, so all the way down to autism. When you start looking at left brain, here's some of the common findings. Here's some of the common deficits. You tend to see a lot of issues with late bloomers with speech, frequently ill, poor fine motor skills, poor verbal skills. And here's some of the common diagnoses. A lot of language disorders, eating disorders, sensory processing issues, dyslexia, acalculia, dyspraxia, selective mutism, and learning disabilities in general. So does this make sense? You know, I bet if you read the book, what a lot of you will do be like, oh my gosh, this is this kid, this is this kid, this is this kid. Because what you'll see is that it's very predictable. When these brain balances begin to occur, you tend to see that there's little parts of social development and brain development. You're like, well, why doesn't this child get the social norms? Why does this child not realize that, you know, you're invading this other person's personal space? Why does this person speak out inappropriately in class? And it starts putting pieces together about why a child does this, because they're not recognizing appropriately social norms, appropriate behaviors, and the right brain and the left brain work as a conversation. The right brain is supposed to tell the left brain, hey, don't do that. And the left brain is supposed to say, hey, do that. They give each other permission. And so when they get out of sync, we see then there's problems with the way that we act in class, the way that we act at home, emotional regulation, all those things. Is that making sense? And then, of course, there's other side effects that we see whenever we start looking down the road of developmental delays, right? There's motor development, emotional development, speech development, sensory processing, and immune dysfunction. And Dr. Lena talked quite a bit about the effects of the sympathetics and on immune function, but I want to talk a little bit more about that for just 1 second, because one of the things you have to remember is that the way that the sympathetic nervous system really works is that it's supposed to be a short-term fight or flight response. When it's on for the long term, what it does is it suppresses normal immune function. This is why you have a lot of kids that get chronic ear infections, chronic strep throat, get the tubes in their ears, always sick, end up with lots of upper respiratory infections, end up going down the road of asthma. Because when the immune system works the way that it should and the parasympathetics are on, we develop a balanced immune system. What ends up happening is when the sympathetics are on too much, they actually create an imbalance in the way the body's able to fight. So things like, I don't know if you guys know this or not, but the vast majority of ear infections are viral. Can become bacterial, but they start viral. And if they infect the cells, right, the parasympathetics control the part of the immune system that triggers the intracellular response to fight off viruses. That's why so many kids have perpetual ear infections that come back over and over again, and multiple bouts of antibiotics don't do the deed, because they're fighting it, and what they do is they become congested with it. Their body traps in their lymph nodes, tonsils, adenoids, and they get these enlarged lymph nodes, and they have to get their tonsils taken out, all that stuff. Does this make sense? And so it creates perpetual weakness. That's why you see a lot of kids that also your kids that deal with some of these challenges, like your sensory kids and your ADHD kids have a lot of immune challenges and they're sick quite a bit, always fighting something. Does that make sense? All right, awesome. So let me give you a story about a kid that we're caring for. What's that? So there's a little dude named Gabriel that we take care of, and he is an ASD kid. He goes to school down near Case Western, and when we started taking care of Gabriel, mom's big goals for him is she wanted to see improvements in focus and attention, and he's got an IEP, like he's got a very tightly managed regimen because of his diagnosis, because he was diagnosed with ASD at 2 years old, and he had a really significant birth trauma. He was a cesarean section with vacuum, so had the worst of the worst type of labor and delivery. And as his conditions evolved and he started to see more and more symptoms become problematic, he had a diagnosis of ASD at 2, and he started developing the flight risk, became a flight risk. He would have significant temper tantrums, very, very speech delayed. He had really significant hyperactivity, and his team was constantly trying to find ways with OT and speech and exercises and things like that to try and calm him down. When we started in care with him, his mom said that his time of focus and attention per his IEP was measured at 2.5 minutes before requiring redirection. Could you imagine having a kid like that in your class?
Do any of you have a child?
Yeah. So his issues were so bad that it required multiple people to work with him on a daily basis, one-on-one, because he would flee on a regular basis. And so, we've had some really, really cool things that we've seen happen with him over the course of the last few months. His IEP team, they call him a curriculum team at his school. They met with his mom and they said that he is up right now to 15 minutes without redirection. Yeah, it was pretty cool. She came in the other day and she had a really cool story. She's like, I've been waiting to tell you this. We had a meeting with the curriculum team on Monday, and he went from 2.5 minutes to 15 minutes. And they said that he used to be super disruptive in class and on the field trips. They said he's been calmer than they've ever seen him. And he was able to get the training wheels off of his bike. It was a huge issue. Like he's a teenager, and he'd never been able to get the training wheels off his bike. So pretty cool stuff. So it's just little things like that. And the thing of it is his brain is changing, right? We're adjusting him, and we watched his brain change, and we're watching him calm down. But what's happening is his brain is rewiring the way that it works. And so as his parasympathetics are engaging more, we're starting to see a calmer Gabriel come forward. He's also having significant improvements in speech output. So he went from only having parroted speech to now he's having synthetic speech. Saying things to like his teachers and his mom and dad. He's expressing his wants. He's expressing some of his own thoughts, some of his own emotions, right? Saying like, I want to eat this, or I want to go here, or I don't want to do that. Things that he'd never had said on his own before, right? Because even though he may have had it inside, right? He may have had the ability to recognize what he wanted to say, his expressive speech did not match what he was processing on the inside. So now what we're starting to see is that loop, right? The expressive and the receptive are starting to become in sync. And he's starting to have the ability to go and think something and then express the thoughts. Pretty cool stuff, huh? So I want to expose you to a very cool concept. So has anyone ever heard of Dr. Hans Selye? So Dr. Hans Selye created this concept that we call stress. And so he wrote a number of different books on stress and the way that the brain works when it comes to stress. And so as we talk about stress, all of us are stressed, right? I mean, I'm sure all of you have stressors on a daily basis, right? We were talking about some of the stressors you guys deal with. But in your classrooms, in your homes, in life, we all deal with stress. We talk about being stressed out, right? In reality, right, stress is more of a physiological response than it even is a state. And what we understand about the way that stress works is it has stages in the way that we respond. He created this concept called the general adaptation syndrome. And so first, he talked about this state called the alarm state. And so the alarm state is the very first trigger of a stress response. And remember we talked about the way that the nervous system is built to work, right? We have the stressor, we turn on the sympathetics, we have the stress response. When the stress ends, we recenter, recalibrate, rebalance, and we get back into rest, digest, growth, development, and healing, right? Well, so what we talk about and what we see is when you talk about kids, we know that these are the early phases where stress is introduced, right? Because when you talk about just getting pregnant, right? Pregnancy itself, right? And for those of you who are moms, it can be pretty stressful, can't it? Right? There's the stressors that are going on in your life. There's the stress of the doctor's appointments, prepping your home, not to mention if there's any kind of complications that you're posed with. All of those things wire your nervous system into the baby's nervous system. Did you know that? Did you know that mom's nervous system directly influences babies? Yeah. So if you're putting off a lot of cortisol and adrenaline, your cortisol and adrenaline, it crosses the placenta. And what it does, it triggers a stress response in the baby in utero. The way that a baby's nervous system is built is so that between conception and week 28, the sympathetic response is what drives development. Between weeks 28 and 32, the parasympathetic nervous system takes over. And then from that point on, it's prepping the baby for life outside the womb. If mom's nervous system is heavily stressed, then what mom's nervous system does is it delays the crossover from baby's nervous system going full on into parasympathetic mode, and it keeps the sympathetics too active. And it causes delays in development of the child's brain. So then all of a sudden they're hitting life outside the womb and the complications of labor and delivery, and their brain is already a little bit behind because of the perpetual stress that mom was going through when she was pregnant. So then you talk about the birth process, and then if that's stressful, then that's another layer of stress added on, right? And that triggers a massive alarm whenever there's an intervention. So, but again, like we talked about, even in just a normal standard delivery, there's a stress that's put onto the spine that triggers the alarms if there's just a little bit too much torque or twisting or force put in. So, and then of course, we talk about postnatal stress, right? What about the NICU stays? So what about if there's constipation? What about if there's, stress in the home? What about if, maybe the baby's, eating something or mom's eating something that's irritating the baby's GI? There's a million different things that can cause a baby's body stress. So, and their nervous system stress that just wires these things deeper and deeper in. And of course, we talk about the things that Dr. Lean elaborated on before, right? So all of these things, from the first time they come on, the more that we're exposed to them, if we don't recenter, recalibrate, rebalance, then they fire the response over and over again. And eventually what it does is it starts to wear down our ability to adapt to those stressors. And we transition into stage 2, which is called resistance. Typically with resistance, this is when we start seeing symptoms, right? It's when it's sleeping issues with a baby. It's when we're starting to see ongoing issues with colic and constipation, temperament issues starting to evolve. And then when they start getting into preschool, it's the kid that's hyperactive and emotional. We start to see some things like, maybe a little bit of, aggression or some emotional outbursts, really quick tempered child. Is this all making sense? And we watch these things go through this ongoing process. And what it's doing is it's progressively wearing down their ability to recover when a stressor occurs. Gas tank is getting lower and lower and lower and lower, but the TAC is really high. The nervous system is being pushed constantly past its ability to recover and adapt to the stressors that the child is encountering on a daily basis. And over time, what it does, it just wears them down. And you're watching these things evolve, and you're starting to see, the temperament get a little bit worse. The focus and attention progressively go downhill. And every year, it's another struggle, and it's a little bit worse. And eventually what you start seeing is that now you've got a child who's transitioning into not only having some challenges with focus and attention, but they start transitioning into what's called exhaustion. This is where it gets really important, because as a child gets older, right, and you start watching the behaviors become really hardwired, it's because they've gotten to a point where they've lived so long that their ability to recover from even common stressors triggers a response, right? And does anybody have any kids in the class where like their temper's a hair trigger? You know what I'm talking about? So that's a kid whose nervous system is so exhausted that they've got no slack left, and the second a stressor occurs, they have a blowout that is way more than what they should have. And that's the kid too, probably when you hear from mom and dad that they go home and they lose it on a daily basis, right? Because what they're doing is they're trying their best to hold it together, but do you guys ever go through your day and get a second wind? Okay, imagine that these kids,
Right now?
Yeah, right? Imagine that when you get a kid that's at this stage, okay? So they wake up and they're already in their second wind because they probably never really recuperated overnight because the nervous system's never going into rest and digest mode like they should. And the more that they're there, the more it wears them down. And when they get to a point of exhaustion as they transition into older stages, right? So you tend to see kids like, for example, if you have a child who has autism, right? It's the child with autism who all of a sudden starts to develop seizures, right? Or it's a kid with ADHD and they start hitting middle school and all of a sudden they start to become depressed, right? You start watching the nervous system become more and more worn down and they're not recovering. It's the kid who was the happy, hyperactive kid when they're in kindergarten, first grade, and by the time you're seeing in 7th and 8th grade, they're the kid who's got the slouchy posture, and they look terrible, and their energy's low. Can you guys relate to what we're talking about with this? This is the progression they go through. And if we don't do something and start recharging their batteries, then it just continues to escalate, right? And that's why you start seeing, right? Kids will use like the ADHD meds or the guanfacine or some of those things to try and help to slow them down, right? But the stimulants, right, like ADHD meds like Ritalin and Adderall and Concerta, those things, they're double negatives. Because what they do is they double stimulate the sympathetics. And what it does, it has this counteracting effect because they're so hyperactive, it's kind of like when we have coffee, right? We dial in for a little while. Well, that's what it does for them. But over time, what it does, it wears them down faster because now they're being driven because they're pushing their sympathetics that much harder to just function on a daily basis. But then they need consistent redosing to keep them going throughout the course of the day, right? And then they come home and they absolutely lose it because if they don't have another dose in their system, all of a sudden they are so depleted, energy so low, there's nothing in reserve, and then they melt, right? Because they've been using the medicine to prop them up during the course of the day. And then the second they don't have it in their system, they absolutely have no ability to hold it together because now they're all emotion, very little logic, and then it repeats, and every day it gets a little bit lower and a little bit lower and a little bit lower. Is that making sense? Mm-hmm. Questions about this so far? Okay. So I want to give you some resources here. So one of the things that we look at here, and we talked about this earlier, is we have to be able to look under the hood. And so in our office, one of the things that we use the thing called a heart rate variability. Has anyone ever heard of this test before, a heart rate variability test? So when you look at a stress test, right? What they're doing is they're trying to see basically how a person's nervous system or a person's heart handles when they're under stress, right? Well, the heart rate variability is taken from a portion of an EKG, okay? And so what that does is it's measuring how adaptable a person is to the stressors around them. But the cool part about the way that an HRV works is it's measuring the balance between the sympathetics and the vagus nerve, okay? And when you look at the way that these present, if we have what's called a really low reserve, it means that on a daily basis we wake up, there's not much in the tank. Gas tank, if the gas tank is too low, we have to dip into the stress response early and often to drive during the course of the day, right? When we look at it on a daily basis, we should have plenty of gas in the tank, not dipping into it too early. The HRV helps us to understand over the course of a lifetime how an individual has adapted to stress and how well, right? Are they varying as they should? Are they dominant towards the sympathetics? And I will tell you, when we see the sympathetics and a child's really dominant or an adult's really dominant to it, it's also when we tend to see the most issues with anxiety, anger. When we see really sympathetic dominant kids with ASD, it's also when the kids are having seizures. Because you know what a seizure is? It's a sympathetic discharge. It's when they get to a point where if they don't discharge energy, then their body will literally shut down. So they seize temporarily, discharge energy, and it's like hitting a neurological reset because it forces their nervous system to go into a phase of recovery. Do you guys know that? Yeah. We care for a lot of kids with seizures. And when you understand that the way that these things work is the sympathetics get overloaded and they have to discharge to recover. Because if you ever notice when a kid has a seizure, what they do is they have a recovery phase they have to go through. And you'll see it could take some kids a few minutes, some kids it takes a few hours, some kids it can take a day or more, especially with a really, really bad grand mal, right? And so that's when we start talking about that. The HRV for us is super valuable because what we're doing is we're looking into an insight that tells us how far down their nervous system's reserves are, but also then obviously as they recover, when the brain has learned how to balance out the stress response more effectively, because we talked about it being like a teeter-totter. And so we use that really and truly with everybody because it's super important to understand, are you varying normally, right? And we've heard this before, like you watch the doctors, you talk to a cardiologist, what do they always tell us about stress? Stress is bad, right? So, yeah, because we know that having too much stress can cause problems with our heart. Well, that's why heart rate variability is used, because what you're doing is you're measuring the influence of the vagus nerve and the fight or flight system through the heart. So when we talk about things like the surface EMG, this is measuring input. And so this is where very specifically what we do, we use this as a way to understand what is going on inside of a child's nervous system from the input perspective. And what's interesting, and I have a slide later on here where we talk about how we look at kids and how the patterns help us to understand what's going on with them. And so when we talk about the surface EMG, there can be very disorganized input, there can be super high energy input, there can be super low input. But what is happening with the nervous system, we can use patterns to understand what the input is like to a child's brain, and does it match what they're expressing outwardly? Do their symptoms match what we see? And what's interesting is when you start really looking at how the input works, we have these classifications because we don't like to label, but sometimes you have to have patterns and ways to go and understand what's coming in. And when we talk about a kid with ADHD, right? So we use this classification, we call them a raging bull, right? Does that sound fitting or for a kid with ADHD or what, right? The kid whose nervous system is on go all the time, hard charging. And what it tells us is that their nervous system is putting off way too much energy than what they're supposed to. And so it gives us a roadmap as we progress, as their energy levels come down and we go through a care plan with them, we watch their nervous system calm, and as their nervous system calms, guess what else does? Their energy, their behavior, their focus, their attention, their emotions. And so being able to have an analysis of patterns that kids present with helps us to be able to better care plan for them as we go through. And then we talk about thermal scans, and thermal scans are interesting because what you're doing is you're literally measuring output from the brain to the spinal cord. It's a straight output measure. And it's really interesting because remember how we talked about with Dr. Malolo where he talked about the right brain, left brain imbalances? Well, so one of the tools that we utilize to be able to understand exactly how imbalanced a child's nervous system is, we use the term dysautonomia, is we use a thermal scan. because the more organized the scan is, right, the better the output from the brain is, but the more disorganized it is, then the more dysautonomic it is, more dysregulated the autonomic nervous system is. And so for us, those are some tools that we utilize on a regular basis, and it helps us to have a really clear picture as to what's going on. And here are common diagnoses with some of the different types of patterns. And we talk about the drunken bulls, those are the classic ADHD kids, ODD, anxiety, sensory seeking, stimulatory kids, the kids that are on go a million miles an hour and really hyperactive. Kids that we call drunken bulls are your kids that typically tend to have sensory processing. So dysregulation of the sensory system, a lot of ADHD issues, very low tone children. So you tend to see the kid that's got the super slouchy posture, right? And then when we talk about what we call the drunken raging bull, that is typically your child, where super, super, super high energy, but extremely disorganized, which is very typical of what you see with autism. And so when we get to a point where we see that, it is the combination of both at the highest level that the brain can handle. So I don't know if anyone's ever seen this. I thought this is a cool graphic. So when we talk about the way the brain works, right? So we talked about how all of these structures of the brain work in coordinating the information that's coming in, and how when the brain becomes disconnected in a child with autism, we tend to see these areas where we have issues with input and output. And if you notice, they talk a lot about the cerebellum and how body movements, coordination, muscles used for speaking, balance, motor activity, all of those things, well, they have to feed up here into the prefrontal cortex. But what's happening is it's getting bypassed and getting sent down into the stress and anxiety center, the amygdala. And the amygdala just disorganizes all of the input to the brain, like Metallica plus Anthrax plus whatever you want to turn on with it, right? So then obviously when you talk about what you want to see is you want to see the background noise calm down as the child's brain starts to reorganize. But what has to happen is that amygdala, it has to get out of the equation. Because if the amygdala is too active, then the child's brain cannot, by the nature of the way the brain works, you can't be in growth and protection at the same time. So to get the cortex on, like we talked about with Gabriel, you've got to calm down the amygdala. And then that's what happened with him. As we calmed down his amygdala, his cortex started to work, and it's beginning to rewire and refire, right? So there's a little dude named Yakub. He's my buddy. I love Yakub. So he goes to school over in Independence, and he's a sweetheart of a little guy now. But when I met his mom at one of the parent workshops that we do, we talked for quite some time about what happened with him, and he was. When we talk about this cascade of events, we talk about this thing called a perfect storm. And all of these things that happen from birth stress, pregnancy stress, it's a perfect storm of things that just start to brew and develop in these kids. And he had the full-on perfect storm. Mom's pregnancy was super stressful, super high intervention. He was a C-section. She had to use a vacuum extractor. And she saw right from the very beginning that things were really going down the wrong road. And when it came time for school, Mom had some concerns because at home he was pretty rough. When he got into school, it proved to be far more true than what they ever realized. When he was in kindergarten, he went to a school that was an adapted school already because they knew that he had some issues. So they had a staff that was like, we're talking behavioral counseling on staff, OTs on staff, classroom intervention specialists, psychologists involved right from the very beginning. Like every resource that you potentially could have for a kid who had ADHD, right, which is a formal diagnosis. But he also was, potentially being labeled with oppositional defiant disorder because in school, he was that kid who not only could they not slow him down, right? He was also invading personal space, becoming aggressive with the other kids and the teachers, disruptive constantly, super impulsive. I mean, a million different things. And it got to a point when we met Mom that they were going to kick him out. They literally said, we don't know what else to do. We've got some of the best resources in the area, and we can't do anything to help him. And so when we talked with Mom, right, about kind of where he was, we said, listen, there's a lot of things that you can do to try and calm a child's brain down, and they tried literally everything. Like he'd been in OT, he'd been in counseling, they'd done a million different things to try and help him. They'd done neurofeedback, they'd done all this stuff, and not a lot of things at that point had taken hold. So we talked with her about let's just take a look. Let's start doing an evaluation. We'll look inside and we'll see what's going on in his nervous system. And it was really cool because when he first started, he had in his entire school year, and we met her, what was it, March? I think it was March. Mm-hmm. So he had never had a day that he did not have a discipline report come home. So we had through the end of the year, right? We said let's just see how he does through the end of the school year and see what kind of changes he makes, and then knowing that we'll have momentum over the summer to come back into next year, knowing that we'll have a lot more time to change things. what was really cool, by the time that we got into the second month, he's starting to have days with no discipline reports. So by the time that we got to the end of the school year, he had an entire month of May where he didn't have one discipline report. It was the first time in his entire school career. But it was neat because what ended up happening is he went from a kid who we couldn't even slow him down to adjust him on the table to a little guy who all of a sudden was making eye contact, who was like starting to have coherent thoughts. And he'd stopped with the violence. He wasn't hitting the kids at school. He'd stopped hitting the teachers. And he was actually beginning to start paying attention. It was really cool. It was like this little different dude was starting to emerge. And so, fast forward and where he is now. So we're now, about almost 2 years? Just shy of 2 years and taking care of him now. And he went the entire year last year and all of this year, and he's got no issues. Like, fully on track. They're to a point now where, like, they're trying to decide if he still needs any interventions. Because he caught up that much. Because once we got the prefrontal cortex to engage and started calming down the amygdala and his stress response began to rebalance, all of a sudden, it's like his brain rebooted. This little different dude started to emerge who now is getting good grades, enjoys school, understands social norms, so it doesn't invade his peer space, doesn't have a fast temper. Actually, he's probably one of the most chill kids that you'd ever meet now. But he was the exact opposite when we first met him. So it's cool. He's one of my buddies. His mom is super cool, and she's a superhero for what she did for him. But I know that's something that a lot of you probably deal with kids like that in your classroom, right? So as we move forward, I want to start giving you some resources. I know we talked about the podcast. So this is our podcast. It's called Growing Healthy Families. Feel free, if you ever have things that you want to learn more about, contact me. When we do these, the simple goal is to create resources that will help you to be able to better help the kids in your classroom. Because if we can help you to help them better, then we've done our job. So the goals that we have is we want everything that we have for you to be able to create tangible things that you can use in your office or in your classroom. And so starting, now that you have a greater understanding, start with empathy, right? Like knowing that obviously these kids, in many cases, they can't help what they're doing. It doesn't mean you don't discipline. It doesn't mean you don't correct. But it does mean that, we have to have an understanding that some of these things are completely involuntary. And so if we can change our perspective in how we work with the children and help them to adapt in the classrooms, then we can get some different results. So secondly, we talked about patterns. So when you start looking at the way that children are behaving, right? We talked about high energy kids. We talked about low tone kids. We talked about kids with short tempers. We talked about kids that are having a lot of issues with organizing, or a lot of kids who are having a difficult time, not just putting it together, right? But sitting down, focusing, organizing, who need constant redirection. And so when you start looking at that, you start getting a better insight as to what perhaps is going on inside, and then ways that you can start looking at them a little bit differently, right? So reward systems that don't involve food. I will tell you, I think this is really important because food's a really easy one, isn't it? Right? It's super easy. Here, we're going to give you some candy, or we're going to give you a treat, right? So what I'm going to talk about here in a second is I want you to understand that if we can get to reward systems without food, you can do a lot to help these kids, because one of the issues that really perpetuates the problem with their focus and attention is up and down blood sugar. So high glycemic index diets are a huge issue, and the vast majority of the kids that we see come in, and diet is a massive issue, and if we can calm down diet, you can dramatically calm down the way they behave.
I'm sure you guys see it. Do you ever, especially in elementary, probably you see their lunches more so than middle school. Mm-hmm. But do you ever look, because I eat lunch with my kids once in a while, and I'll look at some of the other kids' lunches, and you're like, that's lunch? Right? I mean, there's not one healthy thing in that box. You're like, well, there's a cookie, and there's chips,
mm-hmm.
and there's,
yep.
Yeah, and you're looking through, and you go, okay, well, food, I guess, right? And so, the blood sugar, it just
mm-hmm.
spikes.
Yep. And I've got a couple of resources for you later on that I think might be helpful. Obviously, decluttering. And this is something for them too, right? Because the more that we have to filter, the more distracted our brain becomes. So, organizational routines, helping them to have clean desks and staying on top of them. So trying to get them into a routine and a habit that they can control of keeping themselves super organized. And the more organized they are individually, the more their brain will have less stuff to process and weed through on a daily basis, and the less likelihood of drifting if there's less things in their way to go and draw them off. And then movement breaks. So Who in your classroom during the course of a day takes a movement break? Awesome, good,
Elementary, yeah.
good.
Middle school, they're probably, you only have them for what, 45-ish
Yeah, about an hour.
Mhm.
minutes?
Do they still have recess in middle school?
Yes.
Good, good, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Just because they come back and sometimes they're all riled up,
Uh-huh,
and you just want to try and get them focused,
yeah.
and they're just sweaty and they're nasty and they're
Yep.
totally unfocused.
Okay, so let's talk about how to manage that, okay? So remember we talked about the vagus nerve. Okay, so part of what they're doing is they are discharging stress energy they've accumulated. Remember we talked about the importance of proprioception and motion. When a child sits still and they do not move, it's the same reason why we don't want to wiggle and we sit still for too long and want to get up and walk around. When they don't move, they accumulate stress. Turning the temperature up, putting the foot on the gas. So, if you have an understanding that movement is essential for them to be able to calm their little brains down, then perhaps look at ways you can adapt the classroom so that they can have wiggle while they learn, right? So, if you allow kids to chew gum in the classroom, that'd probably be a good thing if they're, kids who need some extra focus.
Do they allow gum at this school?
Mhm.
Oh,
I
okay.
Yeah.
I was say when I was a kid, we weren't allowed to have it ever
Mm-hmm.
in any of the schools, like high school and middle school.
Mm-hmm.
But things change.
Yep. If you notice when the class comes back in that everyone is just buzzing a million miles an hour, then go through and do a cadence on a breath on cadence, right? So the vagus nerve you can turn on and off at will. Okay? And you all know this, right? We talked about this earlier. When someone gets upset, you tell them, step away and take a breath. Okay. When kids are really high energy, pattern interrupt, break it before it goes, right? Pattern interrupts are really important, right? Because nerves that wire together fire together. If the class starts to get wild, the whole class will get wild together, right? So if you do a pattern interrupt, right, where you break the cycle and then you rewire them in a different way, take a breath break, right? And it's literally just do 4 breaths on cadence, where it's 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out, doing tummy breathing, okay? Most kids, you'll notice, they'll breathe chest before they will belly. That's backwards. One of the exercises that you may want to practice with your classes is a hand on their chest and a hand on their belly, okay? And you want to tell them you're going to breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth each time. And you're not going to let the hand on your chest move. So you go like this. Okay? If this hand moves, guess what that evokes? Stress response. If we breathe like this, vagus nerve. It's like pumping the vagus, tapping the brakes, okay? And what will be very interesting is because nerves that wire together fire together, if you work with the kids on doing their relaxation breaths, instead of it taking 4 or 5 breaths when you start, by the time you hit midway through the year, they can turn the gears off in 1 to 2 breaths because you train their brain to calm itself down just by teaching them the importance of breath. And that would be great if there's a situation that starts to spiral with kids getting upset, right? If a kid's starting to lose their temper, right? If you can get them to back down before it escalates and have them take a few deep breaths, you'll at least get a rational child who you may have a moment to talk to them before things start to spiral. But remember, nerves that wire together fire together, okay? And so if stress escalates with you, stress also escalates with them. They perceive your stress. So the more stressed you are, the more stressed the kids in the classroom will become. So always be self-aware.
So take your breaths.
Yeah.
And then do their breaths with
Yep.
them.
Exactly. And also if you have the ability to, and if you've got time during the day with the kids, or if you can recommend it, the more the kids move, if there can be, classroom yoga or something like that, where there's space or time, the more you can get kids to move on a daily basis, the better their behavior will be. Because, yeah.
What if they're one of those low-tone kids? They're very ADD,
Mm-hmm.
very low tone.
Mm-hmm.
They take Adderall though, and it doesn't stimulate them.
Sure.
And they're very out of it
Mm-hmm.
all the time. What do you do with them?
It depends very much on the kid. So do you, in the classroom, do you guys have any type of adaptive technologies that you can use?
I mean, I guess it. What are you kind of
What
looking
grade?
at?
What grade are you?
Eight.
Gotcha.
Teenager.
Yeah, so when you have a child who's a true low-tone ADHD kid, So it's not unusual that Adderall doesn't work because it's not a matter of them needing to actually have the stimulant to calm them down. So it's helping them to be able to go and get more proprioceptive input to try and calm their brain. Okay.
Is it they're hyper though, or they're just out of it?
Mm-mm.
They're just out of
They're
it.
just out of it.
No.
Like,
But
With anxiety,
yes.
high levels of anxiety.
Well, and that probably, and honestly, that probably was a child who was probably higher tone than went low tone. Because very typically what ends up happening is that they'll go high to low at around that age. Boy or girl?
Boy.
Okay. Yeah, it's around the age when you tend to start seeing the adrenals become extremely fatigued.
Yes.
Yeah. And you start seeing them go from high to low tone. And so the stimulants won't really have much of an effect when they get to a point where the nervous system is totally worn out. What I would do is I would work on movement breaks. I would be very aware of giving him additional stim. So you could do things like things for his hand. So if you give him like a stress ball. So if you have a wobble chair that he can sit on. So vagus nerve also is very helpful, right? So having him go through and doing breaths, very, very helpful. You may want to make a recommendation for his mom and dad to look into doing things like brain tap at home. And I'll explain what that is here in just a sec, but brain tap can also help with retraining his brain to be able to throttle up and throttle down and stay in sync. Because we're talking about not just low function of the cortex, but brain waves that get very out of sync. And if you can do things to try and help the brain waves to resync, then you can improve brain performance, especially if a kid is having issues with organizing the input coming in. It's a really cool tool. A lot of us, we do the brain tap on a regular basis. It works really, really well. And there's different levels of it. And there's, I know that even with brain tap and some of the other things we'll talk about, oftentimes they can bring the technologies into the school. So that may be something if you guys can, maybe get brain tap to even give a demo. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll, set up schools. Because I was actually interviewed Dr. Porter on our podcast, and he had a school in North Carolina that they did an ADHD study, and they had, Dr. Brandon, was it 86 or 87% improvement in ADHD in the kids that were diagnosed?
Yeah, pretty much 90, yeah.
Yeah. Think about that. And they had the kids that were diagnosed with ADHD would come in and they would do one brain tap session every day that they were in school. And they were able to improve their symptoms by up to almost 90% during the course of the study. It's a really powerful technology because it keeps their brain able to throttle down and help to reorganize it.
and the sessions aren't very long.
No.
So when they're doing that, it doesn't take up a lot of time. It's short.
Yep.
Relatively short.
Yeah, 15, maybe 20 minutes. So depending, and it's something that mom and dad can do with them at home. So the sessions are really geared so they can be done anywhere. It just requires a headset. If a kid really needs quite a bit more, they can go so far as they can have like a full head piece where you're getting visual stimulation, auditory stimulation, vibratory, and light. But it's really, really powerful stuff, and it can do a tremendous amount of good in helping a child's brain to reorganize. So let's talk a little bit about some of the resources, and I'm sure probably a lot of these you'll already be very familiar with. So for those of you who've never worked with a pediatric chiropractor, I would encourage you. It's amazing. I know we've been very privileged to see the kids and the stories that we've talked to you about. We've seen some miracles in our practice. So if you don't know a pediatric chiropractor, get to know them. If you want us to help you in any way, shape, or form, let us know. I know many of you probably have relationships already with OTs, speech and language pathologists. Has anyone ever worked with vision therapy? Vision development team here in North Royalton. Another great resource. Many times if there are children that are having issues with especially with comprehension, and you notice that they're having a difficult time just their eyes tracking when they read, sometimes they may need vision therapy. And it trains the brain to be able to go and follow the words, process it, and it retrains the pathways in their brain so their eyes are able to go and read linearly across, back and forth. Anyone ever worked with neurofeedback or biofeedback? Two really good technologies. There's some centers in the area that have it, a couple within about 15 miles of here. There's one that's called Cleveland Neurofeedback, another one that's Brain Core Therapy. And so neurofeedback has some really good research on it. One of the things that it does is it's a rewards-based program. Most of them have like an EEG that they put onto the skull. And what they'll do is it'll listen to the brain waves while the child watches a program. It might be a movie, it might be a puzzle, but what it does is it rewards the child's brain for staying in focus and attention. And over time, it helps the child's brain by rewards, because if they come out of focus and the EEG detects the brain waves are coming out of phase, then it'll turn down the program or stop it if they become really out of phase. And then the second that they realize, oh, geez, and they fire back in, it lights the program back up, and the longer they stay in phase, the more it rewards them. And over time, it trains their brain, because what it's doing is just feeding back to them exactly what's going on, but it rewards their brain by staying in sync. Physical activity, I will tell you, one of the best things that you can do is make sure that your kids are active. So, you know, if they're a child that's not doing extracurriculars and they're spending too much time on video games and not getting out and playing, really have a conversation with moms and dads about the need for physical activity. So there's a million different resources, right? And what you want to look at is you want them doing things that are cross-body, not stuff where it's just one side. You want things like where they're doing yoga, they're doing Ninja Warrior, they're doing martial arts, swimming.
Bilateral movements, to use both sides
Cross-body
of the brain.
movements. Yep. And the more they do that, what you'll watch is that you'll see progressive improvements in brain performance because they're getting constant doses of proprioceptive feedback via the spine and the extremities, and it'll keep the prefrontal cortex active, okay? Because remember, that process of rewire, refire, nerves that wire together, fire together, it's ongoing. So once they start doing it, you want to make sure that it's reinforced. Keep moving, keep doing these activities. Make sure there's something year-round the child is doing that is keeping them in motion so that, number one, they're able to discharge the stress energy, two, get proprioceptive feedback to keep the brain on, and help them to stay in a state of changeability. Because now what they'll do is they'll build up more and more and more adaptability over time.
So our kids aren't old enough yet. Are they allowed to have electronic devices in school?
You mean like a cell phone or a
Yeah.
Chromebook? Ours carry Chromebooks with them all day
Mhm.
now.
And phones? Are they?
Yeah, I mean they can either keep them with them or in their lockers.
So they're allowed to text and.
No, they're not supposed to be doing that during class or
Mm.
anything. But I mean sometimes, sometimes if we have like a certain kind of program where they can like a Kahoot or something like that where they can respond on their device, you know, that they can hook in and participate in a game that way or use a Chromebook for that. But
Gotcha.
but otherwise they're not supposed to be using it for personal reasons during the day.
But they're connected then 24/7. I'm sure almost all of them have them,
Yeah.
right? So they're okay.
So,
Yours too?
We
Yeah.
have Chromebooks and we use them quite often.
In elementary.
Yeah.
so
We have to teach them how to take the test for the.
For the
Gotcha,
standard.
yeah.
Yep.
okay. So one of the things you want to have a conversation with moms and dads is there needs to be limits on time of exposure to video games. WHO actually came out last year, in I think 2017, with an official diagnosis of video gaming disorder. And they had hard limits on time of exposure, especially the younger the child is, the smaller the window. Maximum of no more than 1 hour per day exposure, okay? Realistically,
That's a lot for a little kid.
I know,
That's
but you know
it,
what? You
but
would not believe the number of
you-
kids that come and get 3, 4, 5 hours of it a day,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
So, but here's a rule, and I want you to understand how this works, okay? In addition to keeping strict limits, there's a 30 on, 5 off rule. Harvard University did a really interesting study, and it was a focus and attention study based upon performance and academics. What they found is that no matter how high functioning a person's nervous system is, when you push past 30 minutes, they're dipping into their sympathetics to push past that point. Is that interesting? So what you need to do then at that point is consider telling mom and dad that when they're doing their homework, no more than 30 minutes before they take a 7-minute wiggle break, which means they get up, move around, go do something entirely different on a timer, and then come back for no more than 30 minutes. And it needs to be something where they have controls on that. And if you can implement something like that in your classrooms where maybe you can have, set breaks during the course of the time in class, where you could have a 5-minute break where they get up, wiggle around, maybe turn on some music and have them move. The more they can move during that interval, the better job they're going to be able to do to get their cortex back on, because movement stimulates the parasympathetics to kick on the prefrontal cortex. So consider different ways you can implement movement more in your class.
So when they play for 3 or 4 hours a night and they battle the robot or they race the car or whatever, that we don't have video games yet in our house, but whatever it is they're doing days, they're in it, right?
Mhm.
They are immersed, high sympathetics, right? Because like we talked about, that's your ready to go, that's your fight or flight, that's your like, gotta run, gotta go, gotta save, it's intense,
And they block everything else out.
They
and
do.
so you block
Yeah.
everything
intense
so,
filtration.
And then parents like, they won't go to bed. Of course they won't go to bed.
They're
Yeah.
so stimulated.
They
can't-
are.
Correct.
Yep. And I
Correct.
cannot.
And then they're moodier, and then that's why mom's like, you need to do your homework, or it's time for dinner, and they're like, I don't want to, right? Because they're already in a higher
Yeah.
state of arousal, so their responses are coming out heightened as well.
Mhm. So we talked about nutrition a little bit, but I want to spend just a moment on this. Nutrition is really important, right? Because if we have lots of inflammation inside of our bodies, then it doesn't just go to our body, right? It arouses our central nervous system. And this connection is a really strong one. That's why you see some kids when they have high glycemic index, like lots of sugar in their diet. So they'll have that window of 2 hours where they're off the charts, like super hyper, and then 2 hours later, then they drop and they're like face planted taking a nap on their desk for a little while, right? And then they have a snack, and then it's super high in sugar, and they're wound up for 2 hours, then you can't rein them in, and then they crash right before the end of the day. So making sure that when you're talking with moms and dads, say, hey, listen, I noticed that little Johnny's coming in with a lot of sugary snacks. Can we do something like berries? Can we do something that's not going to be so high in sugar? If we can keep his energy levels a little more stable, it'll help his behavior. So some clear research on this. So and also limiting exposure to allergens. So gluten is a pretty strong irritant to the nervous system. Casein is also very potent, and a lot of different types of dyes can be very, very irritating. So if you want a great resource, this is one of my favorite books. It's called The D-Flame Diet. And I don't know why he had to call it diet to get it published, but in reality,
Did
what
he
it,
really?
yeah, I interviewed the guy for our podcast, and so we talked a lot about this deflame process. What it is that if you can bring down inflammation in the body, then you can bring down inflammation everywhere. Central nervous system, everything calms down. And so much of it is understanding that all of the foods that we take in, they can either trigger a neurological and an immune response, or they can calm down the nervous system and the immune system. And so the calmer the nervous system and the immune system is, then the better we perform in anything that we do. Because like we talked about before, garbage in ultimately equals garbage out. Great book. I would encourage you to read that. Here's some of the assistive technologies. We talked about BrainTap. There's the website for BrainTap. I would encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about it, try it yourself. It's fantastic. And if you have some stress issues, try it. It's a really cool program to help you to wind down at the end of the day, or to help to get you focused in for your day.
The podcast can give you a lot more information about it from Dr. Porter himself.
Yep, I interviewed him on
If
there.
you're interested.
I also interviewed the owner of Westminster Technology, and his name's Ted Klopp. He and his wife Erica, they actually have their businesses here in the city of Cleveland, and it's a great company. I have a couple of things in there that I'm going to spend a moment on for you that I think you'll find really cool. And then the local brain core therapy is where neurofeedback can be found here in the Cleveland area. So I want to show you something which I thought was really cool. So this is the website for Westminster. And so they are an assistive technologies company with a number of different products to help people in the school setting to find the right assistive technology for the children in your classroom. So let me show you one of the really cool ones that we talked about. Robots for autism. So if you have any autistic children in the school, or if you know of any autistic children yourself, so one of the issues they have is learning social norms, right? So the robot helps to teach them social norms. It's really interesting. They have a cool video where it talks about the way that the robot works and how, because children with autism have a difficult time recognizing expression and meaning of behaviors and things like that. What it does everything in a very consistent way without variation. So the children are able to start understanding the meaning of social norms and context because they repeat it in the same way over and over again. Over time, it trains them to become more responsive to social norms and behaviors. Pretty cool stuff. If you get a chance, go on the website. It's a really cool technology. And also reach out to them. One of the things they do, which is very cool, is that they will train the staff at the school on how to use the technologies. They do a very in-depth assessment process. And then they'll find what technologies are most beneficial for the kids that have special needs. And so then what they'll do then is they will pair you with an instructor. And oftentimes what they'll do is they'll send an on-site instructor, and they'll teach whoever's going to be the intervention specialist how to work with the child in the classroom setting, how to go and do the assessments so that they can get the best result from it. And then they have ongoing training. They also do a lot of CEs, So they do a lot of CE training. So I think they have a tab up there for professional development. They have CEs on their website that they do on a regular basis. So that also might be beneficial for you as well. Any questions about that?
How much do they charge per hour or?
You know what? I'm not really sure. Everything is going to be priced differently. Okay. So like I know that they have their pricing. Some of the pricing is they'll tell you just to call and request. But I know that they'll go through and they'll, based upon what you're looking for, they can give you or the administration quotes on anything. So what we talked about tonight is we talked about what the missing piece is. We talked about the role that birth process is having in neurodevelopmental disorders and how it's affecting our kids and our health. We talked about how stress is literally wreaking havoc on our children because we're seeing so many kids with stress stuck on. We are seeing how the brain and the nervous system is built to work. And we talked about it's supposed to work in balance, able to respond to stress and not get stuck. We talked about common threads in neurodevelopmental disorders. The biggest one being is that nerves that wire together fire together. Once their brain goes down the pathway of having the stress wired into their nervous system, it is essential to try and break that cycle as early as possible to optimize brain development. So if you know of a child where, a younger child that you're familiar with, and they had a traumatic birth, the earlier that they can have someone intervening, the better the likelihood they have of maximizing function. And we talked about resources. We talked about in-school resources. We talked about different types of providers. We talked about things that can be done at home. We talked about different technologies that are available both at home and at school. And we talked about our podcast as a resource for ongoing education to try and learn more about how to help yourselves and how to help your kids in the classroom. So I am so thankful that you took time to allow us to talk with you tonight. So if you don't, do you have any questions here as we get going? I'm going to go ahead and stop this.
Thank you for listening to the Growing Healthy Families podcast, the world's #1 source for health education. Make sure to go to iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts and give us a review. Make sure to follow us on social media at the links listed in the show notes, and let us know what area of health you are struggling with so we can get you and your family on the road to epic health.